Bharat has a massive problem in the north. It is called China. In the past few days, scores of our soldiers have been killed in action while trying to push the Chinese intruders back to their side of the border. The area has become a global flashpoint, and the fear of an escalation is keeping international watchers on their toes. I must confess that I don't have the slightest knowledge of military strategy, and I defer to the judgment of the military leadership on how, when, and with how much force they want to respond. But the armed forces do not operate in vacuum and are in fact subservient to the political establishment, that is, the Indian state. In this talk, I want to interpret the ongoing events through the framework of the game theory that I introduced in the last episode. There were many questions about its practical implications, and I do hope that this video will do some justice to those queries too. Now, back to China. It poses other threats too. As I mentioned in an earlier pinpoint video, Chinese diplomacy can be fairly expressed in the maxim of managing the periphery. And since India happens to be on its physical periphery, China manages India by keeping it unstable. Maoist terror, demographic alteration, unnecessary border disputes, shaping public opinion through its media mouthpieces in India, and a lot of other similar interventions. China has also supported the terrorist nation of Pakistan and thwarted critical initiatives like India's bid to enter the nuclear suppliers group. In the recent decades, China has also managed to remarkably shift the trade deficit in their favor, and I think it stands at something like $55 or $56 billion today. Chinese investment forms the biggest chunk in Indian startups in the last 5 years. Now, another recent happening deserves our attention. That is, an Indian civilian was killed and 4 others injured in an incident of firing by Nepal police at the Indo-Nepal border in Bihar. We can all draw a fair conclusion about who is really instigating trouble in the Indo-Nepal relationship. A couple of days back in the news, I saw an Indian Army personnel visiting residents of the terror-prone Shopian district of Kashmir and counseling the people on why they shouldn't encourage their kids to pick up arms. A few years back, there was a similar news about army building and running schools in the valley. And it makes you wonder, where exactly does the Indian state place the armed forces in the scheme of things? They are routinely humiliated, killed and attacked in hostile zones within India, and yet they are made to carry out these farcical exercises. Is that the role of the army? I wonder why that is so. Let us turn to first principles. What makes a nation? Why do people care for it? What difference does it make if another country annexes a part of our territory? Why does the thought of China usurping parts of Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh make Indians angry? Likewise, why does the same thought not make other Indians angry? Finally, what if China offers great benefits to the people of these regions? Would it be right for them to side with China? After all, the Indian state also promises roads, electricity, education, jobs, and so on. And if China can do a better job at providing these things, would it not be better for the Indian people in these regions to switch their allegiance willingly? Most people would instinctively find such a scenario morally abhorrent. They would call such an act traitorous, and I would agree with them. But as we know, there is a chunk of Indian population that has secessionist tendencies. Like a lot of Kashmiri Muslims want to join Pakistan. So how do we resolve or at least understand theoretically these tensions and then hope to put the theory into practice? We all know what nationalism means. The textbook definition of the term is a support for the nation you belong to, often at the expense of other nations. But if we go a step further, we find that there are 2 kinds of nationalisms, territorial and civilizational. And which one predominantly informs your worldview determines how you answer the questions that I posed earlier about loyalty towards your nation. Let us take a stroll down the memory lane to the time when India gained her independence from colonial rule. At the time of independence, the great challenge before us was the merger of various principalities and kingdoms into the Union of India. The tremendous efforts of Sardar Patel in achieving this nothing less than a mammoth task, these are all well known. And so when India started her journey after regaining her freedom, it was legally integrated by various treaties of accession. Now, the challenge before the leaders was of forging a sense of unity among the people of India. This was a peculiar challenge because although the cultural unity of India went back several millennia, this unity was challenged by a new religion that had cemented its presence in India over the last few centuries. Therefore, well before 1947, the question of Hindu-Muslim coexistence was begging to be answered. To put it plainly, a huge chunk of the Muslim community wanted India to revert to the Mughal-style Islamic state, or alternatively to divide India along religious lines so that they may establish the new Medina, which later came to be known as Pakistan. We know that after partition, India became a secular democratic republic. Nehru became our first Prime Minister, and he took upon himself the task of building a modern India. Now, for Nehru, the task of forging national unity was urgent, and he can be credited with the first attempt to make nationalism as the official religion of India. In Nehru's imagination, since Hinduism and Islam were pretty much irreconcilable systems of thought, it was necessary to subsume them in a new and superior belief system. He believed that just like people of different religions or cultures can work together in a corporation or like a sports team, it is also possible and indeed desirable to inculcate a sense of unity among the people of India by appealing to their new national identity. Hindus took to this nationalism with ease because it only added one more reason to their sense of cultural unity. But the minorities were not so enthusiastic because it often put them at odds with their religious beliefs and practices. For example, the political vision of Islam is to have the entire world run as per the principles of Sharia. And if they were to place their national loyalty above their religious beliefs, it would be a betrayal of the religious cause. This is precisely why even today Vande Mataram is problematic for most Muslims. Nehru was acutely aware of this inner conflict of Muslims, and he sought to compensate them for this feeling of betrayal by extending privileges and benefits to them. Thus began the era of Nehruvian secularism, which, as you can see, was really an offshoot of Nehru's idea of nationalism. A word on Nehru's famous idea of India. This idea was based on the European sense of nationhood, which traces its origin to the Peace of Westphalia, a series of treaties signed between European rulers, I think it was back in the 17th century, that gave rise to a new political system, a political order in Europe based on peaceful coexistence among sovereign states. As Europe rose to dominate the world through imperialism, this Westphalian model of nation states became mainstream. And by the time the colonial era ended, it had become the default model for those countries that had been colonized. The main reason for the success of the Westphalian model was that it brought an end to the long-standing religious wars of medieval Europe and paved the way for the concept of state sovereignty. Nation states became all-powerful and thus began the colonial era. In the 20th century, aided by new technology, these powerful nation states fought two of the bloodiest wars in human history and conducted the genocide of millions of Jews. By the time the Second World War was over, nationalism had become a bad word in the West. but not for Nehru, and understandably so. Also in India, there was a competing version of nationalism that had gained popularity in the colonial period. This is commonly known as the Hindu nationalism. And as the name suggests, it was a kind of cultural nationalism that rose in rebellion against the British colonizers and recognized them as the alien plunderers of our motherland, which they truly were. This was the nationalism of Tilak and Sri Aurobindo and Savarkar and people like that. And although there are significant differences between their respective conceptions, they all broadly agree that Indian nationalism derives its vitality from the Hindu identity. Which raises the question, who is a Hindu? To which Savarkar responds, anyone who considers Bharat as her Pitrabhumi, that is fatherland, and his Punya Bhumi, that is sacred land. This idea poses a challenge to the loyalty of non-Indic religious groups, primarily Christians and Muslims, whose sacred land is outside India and whose religion places loyalty to a religious institution above loyalty to a piece of land. Interestingly, the Constituent Assembly debates explicitly convey that the makers of the Constitution of India subscribe to the idea of India as a civilizational state rather than the Nehruvian Westphalian nation. Now, the cracks between India's constitution and polity are visible from the very beginning, therefore. Now, cut to the 80s and the 90s when the BJP was rising as a political force on the wave of Hindu nationalism. They encountered the very same problem that had presumably given sleepless nights to Jawaharlal Nehru, which is, how do they forge a sense of unity among Indic religious groups and non-Indic religious groups with the baggage of Hindu nationalism that openly calls out the minorities for having their loyalties outside India. Rather than taking the problem head on, the BJP and RSS took refuge in semantic jugglery. They ignored the second of Savarkar's conditions and said that anyone who is born in India is a Hindu, regardless of the religion they follow. Thus, they reduced Savarkar's Hindutva, originally meant as the essence of the Hindu identity, to merely a geographical marker. However, the trouble was that Muslims and Christians did not take their offer and still accused them of being fascist, exclusivist and whatnot. BJP's watered down Hindutva had still not solved the problem of Hindu-Muslim coexistence. If we look carefully, there is not much to differentiate Nehruvian nationalism from Modi's nationalism. When asked in an interview before he became the Prime Minister in 2014, how do you respond to being called a Hindu nationalist? Narendra Modi responded with something like, I am a Hindu, I love my country, so I am a Hindu nationalist. And thus he completely sidelined the deeper intent behind the question, which was very obvious. Nehru's nationalism asks for loyalty based on a synthetic identity, and the RSS brand of nationalism has come to mean loyalty based on geographical identity. Both give the civilizational dimension a royal ignore. For Christians of India, who have a cultural affinity with the West, they feel organically connected with a global culture because the West dominates. Same is the case with Muslims, who are often seen protesting in remote Kargil over American high-handedness in Shia Iran. Hindus have only India to turn to, and if India disintegrates, the Indic civilization is sure to die with it. Therefore, for Hindus, nationalism is not an intellectual indulgence, rather it is an existential imperative. Again, for Hindus, loyalty to the nation is synonymous with the worship of its geography, because the sacredness of India's mountains, rivers, forests and so on is a core civilizational value of Hindus. But it is not the same thing as territorial nationalism that has no civilizational basis. This confusion can be fatal for Hindus. The Westphalian model of nation states has been useful for the West because it operates within the boundaries of what we call the Western civilization. So, if Europeans no longer value their national borders and want a united Europe, they can dissolve their boundaries because their culture is common. But the moment they come in contact with a different people, a different civilization, their dream of one world gets shattered, as we saw in the recent immigration crisis to Europe a few years back. How does all this fit in the framework of finite versus infinite game? Remember, infinite players play to continue the game and are concerned with propagating values and ideas as opposed to winning short term contests. As the dominant strain of Indian nationalism has always been stripped off of its civilizational moorings, the Indian state participates in the clash of civilizations like a finite player. For India, international conflicts are about protecting territory. For the enemy, they are a path to achieving global dominance. India, guided by the empty rhetoric of territorial nationalism, is always on the defensive, highlighting the body counts of our brave soldiers, while the civilizational nation state of China has a plan to bring the West to its knees. It just starts with the idea of who we are, and if we are to survive the 21st century, India must officially become a Hindu civilizational state. Anything else leads to cultural extinction. The choice is ours. How long can we keep blaming colonialism for our faults?